Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Enhance International Group's fourth in a series of webinars on business continuity planning on steroids, creating compelling risk mitigation plans, leveraging structural modeling. And with us today, we have Dr. Chris White, founder of SCmBLOX, that was in 2023, and scmBLOX in 2015. He's in the great state of Texas.
Woo!
And then we got Greg Schlegel, CEO of the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium, founded in 2011. Can you believe that? And he's from Lewis, Delaware. A little bit smaller than Texas, but mighty, right?
How many Delawares can fit in Texas? That's the question.
First state.
First state. You got to start somewhere.
State.
Hey, we're the only state that was also a country. So
there you go. All right, let's duke it out here. Delaware against Texas.
All friends. Right. We're all friends here.
And then Jim de Vries, founder and managing partner and master integrator of over 80 partners.
Nice.
Founded in 2016 in the great state of Pennsylvania. All right.
Pennsylvania's pretty good.
Well, we're doing it. So, moreover, we really appreciate you joining today's webinar on building an evolving resilient enterprise, our overall goal. And what we're focusing on is discovering your breaking points and vulnerabilities. What are your tipping points? How do you manage through those? So this is the fourth in the series of webinars that can be all found on the EIG website or our YouTube channel. So please reach out and check these out. The last one was a big hit on redesigning the chain and modeling the strategic implications of tariffs, a topic of everybody's concern. Our first webinar was basically starting up on structural modeling and the impact of supply chain policy misalignment. And then we got into the physics of supply chains. And next, after this webinar in December, we're going to be mapping the terrain, navigating the supply chain technology landscape for tactical and strategic advantage. So again, we welcome you to the webinar. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat, and please use the link in there for the Wordle. With that, we'll get started on the deliverables today. The first deliverable is to understand the multipolar landscape and its impact on supply chain design. Then we want to master the strategic, tactical, and operational horizons as a framework for action. And then our next deliverable is how do AI digital twin tools, how do they are seen in action and used in structural modeling? Then we'll get to learn how to assess risks across all three horizons using structural modeling and supply chain risk management. And then we'll look at some actionable playbooks and real world case studies. So with that, we're going to get right into it with Greg kicking us off on the background of the consortium. Greg?
Thanks a lot, Jim. Pleasure to be here with you today, talking about our passion, who we are and what we do. You can take a look at it. We're 33 companies, about 1,700 supply chain risk pros around the globe. What do? We identify, assess, mitigate, and manage supply chain risks across all industries. Got three pillars there on the right. We do a lot of education around the globe, consulting, where we lead, guide, direct, and coach. And we have a host of software as a service solutions focused on supply chain risk and resiliency. On the left, we have our offerings. We have two online education courses. One is for manufacturers, and the other is geared around logisticians and public healthcare. We have an online readiness assessment, supply chain management readiness assessment that basically assesses your supply chain process maturity. We have a supply chain risk and resiliency tool, assessment tool out there. It evaluates where you are in terms of supply chain maturity on our 5-stage model, what your risk appetite is for your company or your division or plant, and what your company's culture is. And then based on that, it provides you action plans to move forward in a risk journey. Again, we do a lot of coaching and consulting, and we have a host of SCR&R platform solutions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Excellent. Thanks, Greg. And SCmBLOX is a member of the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium. But what we do is structural modeling, which you're going to see a little bit later. It's different than some of the other types that you've seen. And we started with the military, so we're commercializing this technology now. But the military had issues with, they have very deep, complex supply chains and understanding beyond tier one and what happens when things happen at tier 2, 3, 4, and deeper in the supply chain. And so SCmBLOX was developed for the military to understand that. So when we say end to end, we're really talking top to bottom. The top, whatever company you are and all your suppliers. And so it's very interesting. We've also got other tools, project management tools, PMBLOX, and some others for asset management, fleet management, resource management, workflow, and things like that. But you'll get to see SCmBLOX in action here in a bit. So I'll turn it back over.
Thanks, Chris. And with that, Enhance International Group, we're over 80 partners now, providers, spanning people, process, data, and technology. And today we're focusing on supply chain risk and resiliency. We just did a webinar on digital twins in the manufacturing area and warehousing area. So we end up getting involved in a lot of different things. Please check out our website for our webinars, as well as all our education from all of our partners, over 100 webinars, over 100 classes. With that, we are today looking at linking simulation to decisions, and that's what we're here to talk about. So let's get on with it. So here's our agenda today. We're going to be setting the stage of supply chain fragility and risk awareness. We'll get into that, Greg and I, and then we'll profile the supply chain horizons, the strategic, tactical, and operational approach to make actions realized. Then our third topic will be stress testing supply chains with digital twins, a case study with Chris leading our way. And then we'll get into this transition states of break-even analysis, similar to what we did last webinar, but a little bit different twists. And then we'll get into what are the structural modeling add-ons and differentiation from existing tools that are out there, like discrete event simulation. And then we'll have some key takeaways and recommendations going forward. With that, we'll get to set the stage here with Greg kicking us off. Greg?
You bet. Thanks a lot, Jim. Wanted to give you a quick thread on why stress testing supply chains matter. What you're looking at is from one of our partners in the consortium, Rapid Ratings. They're forensic accountants. They do a lot of financial health, especially putting out quarterly reports on companies' financial health across all industries. This is coming out of their third quarter report. Over on the top left, they're showing some concerns about volatility and disruption. They kind of came to the conclusion that 27% are higher likelihood of financial distress for private suppliers versus public companies. So they were focusing recently on private, small, medium manufacturers. They also came up with a finding about 23% are projected increase in overall supplier distress due to what? Tariffs, which is what we have been talking about for a good long time during this series. Why, you might ask? Why do they bring up this distressful trend? Well, you and all of us are living with it. Geopolitical shocks, climate events, the still long arm of the pandemic, and as usual, cyber vulnerabilities. What we also wanted to share with you, and they put it in their report, is something called the Fragile State Index Map. They use it as well and provide it to their clients. The legend is basically in the middle. The blue basically says kind of stable. The yellow and the orange are somewhat warnings, and the red essentially is an alert in terms of the fragility of those particular of the supply chains within those companies. And you can see the sectors that are in their crosshair that they think are very vulnerable: primary metals, plastic and rubber, transportation equipment, and wholesale goods. All right. So we wanted to share that with you and kind of set the stage for our discussion. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jim.
So thanks, Greg. So looking at it from a financial perspective purely, S&P Global puts out this report. This latest one was in August by Nick Lazaro and Ann Sabater. And what we see is a general increase in bankruptcies of large public and private companies and debt. And just recently, I would say some of the headlines is that we're seeing an increase in filings, and the trend is only going up. The trend is not going down. From a year-over-year perspective, it was rather flat last year. The year-over-year now is rising at an all-time high. The last time it was this high was at a scary time was the 2000 through 2009, 2007 through 2009 crisis of private debt and companies going out of business. And you can see, well, who's getting hit and what's happening. You can see the industrials and, reorganization predominantly, whereas the financials, there's a lot of liquidation going on. So just as an example. So we're in a VUCA world. The small guys lose in a VUCA world, and we can see that clearly. And if you follow that, you'll see that on the news in any reports. With that, I'll switch it over to Greg.
You bet. Thanks a lot. Jim mentioned the VUCA world. We're going to talk a little bit about time to recovery today. So we thought we'd more or less set the stage for you in terms of ensuring solvency for your company in the VUCA world. So let's take a look at this chart. What you see on the y-axis on the left is the street value of your organization, whether you're public or private, from low to high. On the x-axis is time, always time, from 0 to infinity. So let's take a look. Let's go through a quick scenario. If this black dot is the start of a risk event for your company, which path would you want your company to follow during a risk event? The red path, the orange path, or the green path? I'll give you like 4 nanoseconds to make a decision. Of course, it would be the green path, because you do not want to dig into the ultimate value of your organization during a risk event. But to do that, we advocate that you need to start learning about best practices in terms of reduce the time and duration of a risk event. You need to learn how to reduce the severity and the slope of those lines during a risk event. And then you need to understand how to accelerate what we call time to recovery, TTR, which is at the far right end of that chart. And the issue is, if you learn about the best practices in supply chain risk management, you can be better prepared and more responsive than your nearest competitor during a risk event. And guess what? You can grow market share. So we want to kind of set the stage there in terms of time to recovery, ensuring solvency for you in a VUCA world. And with that, I'll move it over to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. So we have time to recovery, and we thought we'd bring up another statistic that's out there, and that's time to survive. And so this is a static benchmark that came from SCMC and Levy from MIT a number of years ago. And its definition is it measures how long operations can run if the facility or supplier is disrupted. So you could take this at a SKU level or a node level in your network. So how long will it take you to survive? So if the time to recovery is less than the time to survive, or the time to recover is greater. So which one would you want to be in, right? I think we want to be over here where we recover before we would exceed this. This is an interesting concept. It's a good concept to think about, but there are some challenges with it. But the strengths are that it's simple, intuitive, it highlights single points of failure in your supply chain network and provides a baseline. However, we know we live in a dynamic world and it's not linear. So the limitations of this are it ignores the dynamic responses of expediting substitutions, demand shifts, and treats supply chains as static snapshots. So although this is a very interesting way of looking at things, we'll show you how what Chris does with structural modeling takes it to the next level. And so if you, with that, I'm going to throw it over to the next area, which is the supply chain horizons. So we'll look at it from the strategic, tactical, and operational approach to make actions realized. With that, I'll switch over to Greg again.
You bet. Thanks, Jim. I would kind of give you a quick thumbnail sketch of the three risk horizons, resiliency horizons that we see and that we teach: strategic, tactical, and operational. Strategic risk, what are those? Those are risks that are most consequential to an organization's ability to do what? Carry out its business strategy. What complexion is that? Well, these risks tend to have low frequency of occurrence, but very high negative impact, such as tariff and geopolitical risks. Tactical risks, what are those? These relate to mainly external issues with your suppliers and your customers. Remember the customer. They include things like quality problems, late deliveries, service failures, and more and more and more, all in a day, a week environment with your customers and suppliers. The frequency of events in this particular arena are lower. The frequency of occurrences are lower, and the impact is a bit lower than strategic risk. Then we have operational risk. What are those? Kind of a disproportionate set of supply chain risks every day, every hour within your own supply chain. And, those could be things like internal processes, quality, computer issues, people issues, and so forth. The frequency of occurrence with these types of risks in this horizon are very, very high. They occur every single day, every single shift in your supply chain. Very high frequency of occurrence, but very, very low minimum financial impact. So we tend not to fix these. But these are the three horizons that we all learn about, we get certified on, and we wanted to share with you some aspect of risk as well. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jim.
So building on what Greg said, this just breaks it down, what he said. A little bit repetitive here, so I'm not going to repeat, but strategic again are long-term. And some examples here are reshoring manufacturing reduces geopolitical exposure, but increases domestic cost structures and reduces flexibility. So we see that. So should we reshore or should we not? What should we stay or should we go? So those are examples of strategic, as Greg had outlined before. And from a tactical perspective, you get into the bullwhip effect and the demand volatility that's happening, labor shortages that can be caused by different situations, and remedies and responses, including dynamic safety stock policies, supplier collaboration platforms, the dual sourcing. The example here is shifting to nearshore suppliers reduces lead times, but exposes the firm to regional climate risks like hurricanes in Mexico. So when you do move, watch out where you go. Make sure it's always rob Peter to pay Paul, right? So, and then you get short-term risks that Greg talked about, the operational level, that in immediate survival. You get into those geopolitical risks in the Red Sea, extreme weather conditions, cyber attacks, and what can you do to address that? Of course, you end up expediting things, and or you have buffer inventories, so you start creating too much stock, and you have rapid supplier substitution. So those are things you can do to manage that. And the example here is expediting via air freight ensures delivery within the quarter, but erodes your margin because of your increase in transportation costs. So these are three time horizons for resilience that you always have to keep in mind, and always keep in mind that it's the linking of these. We don't want to create more silos in the way that we think. So with that, I want to share with you Chris's break-even chart that he showed us last month. And on the y-axis, we have transit time, where we normalize it at 0, where if you're going to move closer or further away in transit time. And on the x-axis, the tariff rate difference, which is how much increase in tariff can you take where you're at to say where should we stay or should we go. So each one of these bubbles is your profit change due to the tariff rate in transit in weeks. So obviously you want to be in the bottom right, and the upper left is where you're going to have a negative impact on your margin. So this is the impotence of our last project. And so what I thought was really compelling about last webinar is that with Chris's modeling, structural modeling, we're able to identify what is that break even for your company on when you should stay or should you go. So if you're to the left of this, you should not go. If you are to the right of it, in that situation, you will want to consider moving your facility. So again, this is an example. It's not your facility or your operations. This is an example with gaining your insights of your supply chain. This analysis can easily be done. With that, we want to get some feedback from you on how you stress test your supply chain. So we have some ideas here, some like an FMEA, business continuity planning, risk register, maybe a virtual collaboration room. We just had one come in. Tabletop discussions, yep, tabletop BCP, absolutely. Any other ideas, Chris, from your perspective?
Well, I'm all about there's talk and then there's doing, and a lot of scenario analysis and quote stress test for the strategic long term. So we'll differentiate that in a minute, but for the strategic long term is a lot of discussions because there aren't tools out there to really quantify like we do with some of the operational and tactical timeframes. We have more tools to actually do some of that, and so we may put data into tools and actually look for answers. We don't have that. I'm going to show that with structural modeling, so hopefully this changes the game a little bit. But typically these are tabletop discussions and people saying, well, what if this happened? And let's walk through that. But as much intuition and intelligence as we have, supply chains are very complex, and you don't know how others in the supply chain are acting and reacting. And so that causes different things to happen that now we have to act and react to. And a lot of that's not captured in the discussion. So you really got to get to some sort of quantifiable evaluation.
Greg, your thoughts?
We're big proponents of scenario planning. and all good there. I mean, there's many different methods. The issue is execution. Do it. All right. As opposed to being better prepared and more responsive than your nearest competitors. So the issue is committing to do it.
Yeah, and I just build on that, commit to do it, and then make sure you're reviewing it periodically, at least once a quarter, and making sure that you have the roles and responsibilities set up on taking action, as Greg mentioned. Just doing it once without reviewing and updating, you won't get into the groove. That we're going to get into the case study. Chris?
Yeah, excellent. So we like this Venn diagram, kind of pulls everything together. In the lower left, you've got the strategic, tactical, operational perspective that Greg talked about. At the top, what we've got is this strategic risk paradox, which Greg talked about a little bit, which is where these strategic issues have the biggest impact on the company's true survivability and longevity. And so the largest financial impact. And operationally, things that happen day to day, week to week have a much smaller, but we tend to focus more on those. We spend more attention, and yet these big strategic issues, we might use a spreadsheet to look at it or a tabletop discussion like we talked about. And so we're not putting much effort into these things that can have a huge financial impact. And so that's this strategic risk paradox. With structural modeling now in the lower right, we have this ability to look at the structures of supply chain top to bottom and see what's happening. And so this right there in the middle is how we can do proactive planning. We've talked about a VUCA world, and the idea is let's do some of this, let's do some stress testing before we actually experience something, so we can be proactive and be ahead of the game. So when we talk about stress testing, let's just say that basically, any digital twin you already have is capable of some level technically of stress testing, whether you're using spreadsheets, ERP systems, network design, those warehouse management systems. You can play with some variables and see what happens. And so they're all, can do something along those lines. So there's not just stress test tools. Everything that you're using that's any representation of your supply chain can do it, or your operations. However, the effectiveness of the type of stress test being run is completely dependent on the technology that's being used to generate those stress tests. So if you're using static spreadsheets, you're very limited. You're not capturing any dynamic activity that happens in there. Same with any kind of statistics, correlations, regressions. I'm going to forecast, and I got this line that says, hey, we're increasing by 5% every year. Well, everyone else in the supply chain is acting and reacting to that, and so it ends up not really happening. And so you got all these limitations. Even discrete event simulation, which is a structural modeling approach, because of its focus on the discrete items moving through, has limitation in terms of the STO, strategic, tactical, operational time horizon, and it tends to be a shorter term answer. And so that stress testing that's operational and tactical, they're great for, but not the long term. And even linear programming optimization, things like that. You mentioned David Simchi-Levy at MIT. They do some of this when they do it. And that's very static as well. It assumes everything, well, given the conditions right now, here's what happens, but those conditions can easily change. So that's what we want to take a look at. So structural modeling, when you're talking about long-term strategic views of the supply chain and understanding dynamics over time, months and years, structural modeling is the most effective technology for doing this. So we're going to dig into that a little bit, and I'm going to give you some examples. There's a lot of setup here. So for example, if you're using network design and optimization tools, those are fantastic at understanding what the best network you may want. And by network, I mean supply chain structure. So in this example here on the left, you've got a US-based OEM and tier one, and a lot of tier twos are in China. And gee, there's this better thing where I'm going to better structure or network where I'm going to spread them out. Fantastic. That's great. I've spread my risk out. I've got tier twos in 3 different countries. I've moved that tier one to the US. I've reshored a little bit, so that's better. However, those are static situations. Those are just looking at one network versus the other, and they're operating. What's not considered is that transition. What does it mean to move from A to B? What are those operational impacts? Do we suffer some short-term losses that we can't recover from in that movement? And we talk about, should we stay or should we go? Is the juice worth the squeeze? That's what we're talking about. We've got bullwhips that we introduce when we do this. So we are the cause of the bullwhips when we do this. Standing up suppliers take time. All of this can make that transition that, yeah, we want to go from A to B, but if it takes 2 years, that may be too long. We can't survive. So it's very important to understand that transition and what it looks like. So what you saw last time in our last webinar was this chart. This is the same view that Jim had talked about earlier. It's this break-even chart. And what we can do with structural modeling is this very scientific approach, design of experiments approach, where you can run different scenarios. In this case, we ran 16 different scenarios with each value, 25% tariff difference and saving a week in transit time, moving closer. That's one of the scenarios. Then another one is, well, it's a 2-week delay and it's a 50% difference in tariff. And so this is 16. You can count 16 dots there from 16 scenarios. But what's interesting is then you begin to get the feel for the landscape that you're dealing with. And all these possible things, I can begin to understand as a company, where might I be? Where do I want to be? And what can I do to change and get into a more favorable region? So these kinds of charts, I want you to see this because we're going to do the same thing with our stress testing. So I want to, again, emphasize this transition. Network optimization tools that you probably are using are fantastic at understanding these steady state situations, A versus B, and I want to go from A to B. But what they're not good at is understanding the transition, what happens as you go from A to B. And structural models can actually look at that, kind of peel back that box there and put a magnifying glass on it that says, hey, what really happens? What oscillations, what volatility am I introducing myself by doing this, and can I survive it? So the concept with stress testing, I want to emphasize what we do. I want to kind of have a graphic here that gives you a feel for the supply chain. And what we're doing is kind of just pounding that supply chain with different demand patterns. For example, a step where there's an increase and it just sustains. There's a pulse. I increase, I come down. I got some other random pattern. But we call this top to bottom to top, because what it does is it says, I'm going to push the demand down. So there's this increase in demand that now needs to filter through and sort of ripple through everybody in the supply chain. And now over time, they begin to respond, and you've got this upward ripple, this upward dynamic. And so we've gone from top to bottom, and now it's bottom to top as we're recovering. If you think about COVID and bullwhip and toilet paper and all that, we ran out for a while, and it took a while for that to come back. That went through the whole chain. We dried out and emptied the whole supply chain. Took it a while to build back up. That's bottom to top. So what you can do with stress testing is check, since these are just digital twin models, we can run hundreds of them. I can look at any entity and play around with that entity and understand what it's vulnerable to. Is it vulnerable to shocks? Is it vulnerable to, 10% changes or 20% changes? What can it withstand? I can also look at any entity or anywhere in that supply chain, break any part of that chain as a disruption and find out, how everyone else kind of reacts and responds and recovers from that. We can find the weak points in the supply chain, those that really are very volatile, that it only takes a little bit of change for them to suffer. And then since it's a digital twin, we can begin to play around with, well, how can we alter this supply chain? What can we restructure to perhaps increase the resiliency or the response times? So I want to take one specific example. We had network A and network B, and we're going to dig into this network B situation. And this is actually one we had done in a previous webinar. But in this network B, as I showed a couple of slides ago, we've got a US-based OEM and they're tier 1, and then there are 3 tier 2 suppliers, one in Mexico, Africa, and China. And what we're doing here is we're going to just focus. There's a lot we could do, but to keep it short for the webinar, we're going to focus on this Mexico tier 2 supplier is all we're going to look at. So we're going to highlight that, and we're going to look at changes in demand, only 2 variables. Changes in demand, it's going to increase, decrease, by some amount. So changes in demand and the length of the disruption. And so we want to see the demand through the chain, and then if there's a disruption at this tier two, how long that is and the impact that it has. So what we're going to begin to build is a lot like what you saw in the previous webinar, where we're going to run, it's a matter of fact, it's 16 scenarios again, and we're going to look at these two axes like we did before and kind of highlight the extremes and understand what happens. And that's going to lead to another sort of break-even chart. That one had a lot to do with profit. We'll also focus on profit here, but it's really, there's more to it than just profit. But we're going to get to this kind of chart again. So just to set this up, if you've seen any of our webinars, using the exact same model we always have. So I've got a steady state of 100 orders going through this supply chain. We're pretending like we're looking at just one SKU, no yield issues, it's perfect, no waste. But we're not saying the whole company is going to fail necessarily. But if that's the one thing you do, then maybe you do have some issues. We're going to use some conservative, or I'll say moderate, reaction rates in terms of fulfilling inventory. And then we're going to assume that each entity in that supply chain is trying to hold 4 weeks of inventory for both raw material and production. So if 100's going through every week, 4 weeks is 400. So the standard is 100 going through and 400 in these inventories. We're also going to talk about some of the resilience metrics that we introduced before. And you'll notice I don't put time to survive on here because to me that's dynamic and it's hard to adjust. Imagine recalculating that every time there's a high and a low and it completely changes. So what we like to focus on are these three right here. The amplitude, which is my max minus my min for my various inventories. The time to recover once something starts, and when do I kind of settle back down. And the cycles are swings because that's all volatility. If I've got more cycles and more swings, I'm up and down, there's a lot of churn. So I care, I want to have fewer cycles, I want to have less amplitude, I want to have shorter time to recover. So the kind of, 2 by 2 that we're going to lay out here, the two axes, there's a change in demand. We're going to do just a step up, 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, 100%. And then we're going to look at, so that's to the OEM that's now going to get pushed through the chain. And then the length of disruption at the Mexico Tier 2 supplier, 0 means no disruption. So it's only the changes in demand, but we're still looking at that impact. And then a 2-month, a 4-month, and a 6-month. So we're actually looking at, we're looking at 20 scenarios. Now, here's where the stress test kind of comes in, is we're going to have a change in demand starting in month 2 of the simulation. And then we're going to have a disruption starting in month 3. So those are happening fairly close to each other. Now the dynamic, this is a typical chart, and I want to just sort of walk through, you've got the disruption starts, and so now I've lost some supplies for a while. So I see my finished goods start to dip. I see, because I increase my demand, I see my demand go up, and all that's driving less finished goods. I start ordering, I finally get some orders coming in and all that. And eventually I settle down at some new level. So I've moved from one level to another level, and I'm looking at all that transition in between. And if we look at the resilience metrics, now we can see them on here. So in this particular example, the finished goods amplitude was 121%, the raw materials 105, raw materials suffered 3 cycles, finished goods was only 1, and our time to recover was 65 weeks. So in this case, in the specific example, was a demand increase of 60% and a disruption of 2 months. So in that situation, it's taken me 65 weeks to recover. So those are just some of the metrics. So now let's start laying all these out like we've done before. So this is our easiest, simplest situation. No disruption at our Mexico Tier 2, and there's a 20% increase in demand. Now this is a little bit small, but you can kind of see there's this bump up, but it's relatively uneventful. I bump up, I got slight over ordering, but then I quickly settle back down. Now I'm going to show 2 more kind of spreading out on these axes. So now I go up to 40% with no disruption, and we see, okay, it's a little bit bigger. I dip and it kind of looks like that chart we had before, but going down was still just a 20%. And with a 2-month disruption, there's no real difference. So in this case, a 2-month disruption at our Mexico Tier 2 supplier says, hey, we're okay, even if it happens, as long as demand doesn't go over 20%. But now let's fill out the rest of these so you can kind of see. and I put them all on the same scale on the charts. So when you see something go off, instead of making everything fit on the chart, you see some values go off the chart. And look at the difference between the upper left and the lower right. Of course, the upper left is the simplest one, barely an increase in demand and no disruptions. And then now down at the lower right, you got 100%. Demand has doubled immediately, and I'm having this really long disruption. Of course, I'm going to suffer for a while. And so you see all those start to happen a little bit more. So when we lay this out, this gives us our landscape again of how things begin to change and in combination, what happens. So now I want to kind of look at the break-even analysis
So,
of this.
so Chris, before
Oh,
we
yeah.
get there was a comment.
Oh,
I'm not sure when this comment came in, but says that this also ignores customer inventory allocation, limiting specific customers to
yeah.
satisfy all or most.
Yeah, Mark made that comment much earlier in the introductory
Much,
slides.
yeah,
Yeah, and I agree. I forget the specific comment at the time, but absolutely, Mark. But yeah, that was earlier. But
yeah. I
if
just
that's
want
still a
to,
concern, yeah, okay,
I just
um,
wanted to address that before we moved on.
okay. Um, and so what I want to do now is this is that layout of those 20 scenarios, and I'm looking at the profit changes compared to the baseline. And of course, demand is going up. So we ought to be making more money compared to the baseline. And you can see that it's a little bit more when it's only 20% increase, overall profit, given the price and the things that, the other values that we have in here. But what you see, you can kind of see green and red, and you can sort of lay out this break even line again. And now this break even, we're picking on profit, but it's more important that you think of this in terms of a stable region and an unstable region. And that's really our break even is there's certain conditions that we can handle. Our supply chain can handle these kinds of stresses. But there's this other that is too much. And this is great to understand when it's too much. Under what situations is it too much? What things in combination make it too much? And you could do this we only did this for the one Mexico Tier 2 supplier, but you could do this for every supplier at every level. You can just keep doing this. But this is the concept is now I can understand with that one supplier, here's what we can do. And I've truly stress tested and understood what my supply chain is capable of doing. So that's kind of the punchline there. So where might you use this kind of structural modeling? Well, because it's long-term strategic time frame, a lot of the tools that you probably have, you'll recognize some of these logos are more in the operational, the short term, the operational, the tactical end of the spectrum. And so while they're great at that end, they're not helping us understand 2 and 3 years out all these adjustments that are going to happen. So structural modeling can actually is literally an add-on directly to all these other activities. You can take information and data you're using in these other tools and use them in a structural modeling tool like SCmBLOX that's doing this long-term strategic analysis and understand better ROIs. I got 10 risks. Well, which risk hurts me the worst? And so now I can prioritize risks that come out of tools like Everstream or Resolink. I can extend capabilities that might be in an Optologic or in any logistics that's looking short term at networks and understand, is the transition worth it? So this is really where you add on. It's not a replacement. You're not replacing any tools. You're adding on. You need all these capabilities, like Greg and Jim said, operational and tactical end of the spectrum, but also the strategic end.
Yep, very good. We wanted to give you some typical point solution outcomes from discrete event simulations. We've run them many times over the years, and essentially what you're looking at is you're running what if analyses across KPIs that you decide. All right, so you can see them: sales, production, capacity utilization, service, order processes, order processed, missed orders, and on and on, inventory and so forth. The blue, what you're looking at The blue is a baseline. When you run discrete event simulations, whatever you use, you need to develop a baseline in terms of this model is representative of how we run our supply chain today. Normally that takes a couple of weeks and you have a baseline. And the folks try to get that model, the digital twin, the model, as close as they can get to your existing P&L data. Once you have the baseline, then you start to run discrete event simulations. You can take a look. The red, the first scenario after the baseline might be the red chart, the red graph. You might have a scenario where you want to increase sales and garner some market share from the closest competitor. So then you run that discrete event simulation and you get, what does your production look like? What are your capacity utilization, service, orders processed, and so forth. The green could be a second scenario where you're changing your customer base, or something happened and you have the same amount of sales but different product mix, and you can take a look at that. The net, folks, is discrete event simulation, from our perspective, provides you the financial impact of each scenario, but doesn't really provide you, as Chris mentioned, the journey, the during, in terms of getting to that destination. So we wanted to just give you a sense of, yes, you can do discrete event simulation and get point solution numbers across your KPIs, but it normally does not allow you to understand the journey and the movement from point A to point B when you make a decision. So with that, I'll turn it back to Chris.
Absolutely, Greg. That's a great example of static solutions. It's for a one situation, what's happening, but the real world over time is dynamic. Everyone's adjusting. So what you see right here are a couple of different structural modeling approaches. So again, system dynamics, what we happen to use, not the only one. So discrete event simulation, you see in yellow and orange down there, kind of at the lower left, and the sort of the level of the abstraction is on that y-axis, and time is kind of on the, it's not really shown there, but is on the x-axis, the horizontal axis. So discrete event is great with a lot of details. So less abstract. I've got all the information I need, but very short term, because the approach is I'm going to model every little thing running through there, and that just doesn't work when you're trying to go 5 years out, and I'm using other companies, involving other companies in these simulations. And so the technology itself is somewhat limited. Then agent-based modeling is sort of in the middle there and is kind of capable at kind of being very detailed, but also a little bit more abstract. I don't have all the data I need, so I'm going to use some basic assumptions. And that's another type, but it's also sort of limited as it goes out. Then you have system dynamics, which is in that upper right. So notice system dynamics is not good for the things that discrete event is good for, and discrete event is not good for the things that system dynamics is good for. So even within structural modeling, there's this aspect of the right tool for the job. And so if you're looking at long term, where I don't necessarily have all my data, but these are the huge, big decisions, and I want to see all the adjustments in the supply chain, system dynamics is the way to go. And what we actually do with SCmBLOX is we develop agents that are system dynamics models. And so we capture kind of the best world. And so when it comes to AI, we're actually using agentic AI. Those are agents. They're kind of the, OG, old school agent-based modeling, or that's agentic AI, what we're calling it now. And so agents are making decisions based on policies that you've given them, and you're seeing how everyone acts and reacts in that supply chain. So, Jim, I'll let you. I believe we've got another poll question to ask.
Yeah, we're just back to the poll, just trying to get this to respond. So looking to see if anyone else entered any comments on how you stress test your supply chain. Look forward to your comments here. I see audits here. Drills, risk drills, maybe, I'm not sure. Things are coming in. I think we hit this pretty hard throughout the webinar. welcome any questions about the different approaches and the pros and cons of each approach. Not saying that one's necessarily better than another, that it's knowing when to use it and what you're going to get out of it, and how structural modeling can add value beyond what you're seeing today from these results. And very often we get stuck in the middle, right? We say we want to go to that 2B state, like Chris mentioned, and we think it's going to cost X, and then it ends up costing X squared, right? and
Exactly.
and I think that's the best thing about this is sometimes people move when they don't need to move, and they don't really understand the risks of there's all these other risks that are encountered when moving a supplier, and not taking into account what it's going to end up doing to your supply chain. And we're not to mention all the other risks you have in potentially losing customers during the move because you're not able to fulfill orders, and then you have to prioritize, and all of a sudden you're losing some of your good customers because you haven't planned properly. So there's a lot to go into moving well beyond what we're talking about here. Any other comments, Chris?
No, I think absolutely. Stress testing is very important, and being able to quantify and get beyond just discussions and really understand the operational impact, because you're low on inventory for a while. That's a lot different than, the simple answer. You don't snap your fingers and get from A to B. There is a journey, and it's the journey, not the destination. The journey can hurt you sometimes, and you just want to understand when it's worth it to take that journey.
Excellent. Greg, any closing comments on this?
We're big advocates of stress testing for risk management and so forth. If you can do it, it helps provide informed decision making. So as opposed to gut feel. Hopefully it has resonated with the audience.
Fantastic. With that, we're going to move to the final section of key takeaways and recommendations. Chris?
Yeah. So first thing, just stress testing, it provides enormous value. I think we've said plenty of that, and we're really pushing that. It helps identify vulnerabilities. I mean, if you think of anything that you practice, if you're in a sport, you practice that sport. You stress test yourself in the sport to understand where your weak spots and what are you good at and what do you need to work on, and you do that. So stress testing can identify those vulnerabilities, and it can show you where in the strengths, where is your supply chain already fairly resilient, so I don't need to worry as much about that part of the supply chain. This other one that's very vulnerable, and I've got tipping points that I got to worry about. Those are the ones that stress testing can help identify. And we may know that a bullwhip may occur, but stress testing can help quantify that and figure out what our response and recovery times are. Now, what we showed you was a very simple example. So stress testing can be as complex as you need. We just showed a step in demand going through. We could have run other patterns through, a ramp up over time, a pulse, like a holiday of, for 3 months, we're going to get hammered for a while and then it's going to settle down. What does that do? Other factors other than disruptions might be included. Transit times could change. If there's now delays in the shipping system, then maybe some of these transit times are a little bit slower. Suddenly quality levels have changed, and we assumed 100% yield, and now it's down to 90% for some reason. Well, now not everything's getting through, and we've got to adjust for that. So there's lots of other ways. And you can look at the entire supply chain, or like what we did, just pick a thread of the supply chain and analyze that. So without anything else to worry about, we isolated that Mexico tier 2 supplier. Just in our example, I'm not picking on Mexico. If you got companies in Mexico, I'm just saying in that example, we picked on one tier 2 supplier and found out where they broke down and understood the stable and the unstable regions. And you can do that with the entire supply chain, or, again, threads of the supply chain. So I'll let Greg kind of get to the moral of the story here.
Yep. Thanks, Chris. 1 second, folks. Yeah, kind of the moral of the story, we want to kind of put a cap on our discussion, kind of using structural simulation. I think we've proved that it can provide you guidance during. The key is during the transition, as we mentioned. It can reveal vulnerabilities, as Chris mentioned, inflection points. We talked about triggers so that you can make the best informed strategic decision. All right. So you can launch, we would advocate you launch structural models based on maybe your business continuity planning tabletop outcomes. Think of that way. Those are manual, but maybe you can begin to turn those manual tabletop discussions into a more dynamic structural model. And what we advocate is gamify your business continuity planning. Why do we say that? I will, as a career educator, I will give you our motto. I see, I forget. I read, I remember. I do, I understand. So we advocate gamifying your business continuity planning process using structural modeling, and I'll turn it back over to Jim.
Well, Greg, that was a great way to wrap up the webinar. I think we hit all the deliverables here in spades. And if anyone has any more questions, I saw a question come up. Chris, do you want to comment on that question?
Yeah, so Tom asked, well, if you've got two different organizations part of the same supply chain, how can the two results be used to predict? What you would do, you would run a stress test. You could do them individually and kind of see how each one individually acts and reacts under certain conditions. But what we'd more do is pull those together and have them in the same stress test. And so we'd expand that scope to include both of them to understand, is there any interaction and reaction and adaptations, whatever, among those two that could have an influence. They may still be very isolated and may not change the results, but it may change the results depending on the structure. It's hard to understand without a specific example, but that could easily be pulled into a combined model.
Thanks. Thanks, Chris, and thanks for the questions. Really appreciate it. Very insightful. And we hope you enjoyed the webinar and look forward to following up with you with any questions you have. Feel free to reach out to Chris, Greg, or myself. Our next webinar next month will be mapping the terrain, navigating the supply chain technology landscape for tactical and strategic advantage. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank Chris and Greg for the hard work putting together the webinar. So Chris, any closing comments?
Yeah, every webinar, if you followed the whole, this is, 2 series and this is the 9th total, but you've seen us building more and more complicated. And I'm really looking forward to next month's, the next webinar as well, because we'll talk about different types of technologies. We touched on it here and the appropriateness of those technologies across the supply chain, analysis landscape, so to speak. So it'll be very insightful as well.
And Greg?
You bet. Yep. Hopefully, we've given you some threads on processes, tools, techniques to do what? Make better informed strategic decisions, folks. So all the best with that.
Thanks, Greg. And we just had a question come in that I thought Chris is probably salivating on because we don't have time to talk about everything. So, but I'll let you go on this one.
Yeah, I said yes. I mean, can it be done? Yes, it'd be a slightly different model, but can it be done? Absolutely.
And that's an area that you actually wrote a book on, right?
Yes, I did. Yep.
So it's not just a by the way, yes. It's like emphatic yes.
Yes, exactly. I should have put an exclamation point on that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So Sergio, thanks for asking that question. We just don't have enough time to cover everything during these webinars, but maybe that's a good future webinar sometime, Chris.
Yeah, it gets into the micro. Like I do a lot of Lean Six Sigma. It's micro lean versus macro lean. Micro lean is my own processes in my own company, and I'm trying to lean those out and get some smooth flow. And then macro is, yeah, but I got a whole supply chain doing this, so let's do that. And so what we're talking about is at that supply chain level. But Sergio, absolutely, it can be done internally.
Thanks, Chris. And with that, I want to close it out and thank again Chris and Greg, and of course all of you for attending the webinar. You make it worth our while. We really appreciate it. Appreciate the comments, questions, and feel free to follow up. You have the email from this morning, and please do follow up. Thanks so much, and look forward to seeing you next month. All the best.